What's up everybody, Coach John, back here with another video aimed at helping you make weight loss easy. Now today we're going to talk about cardio, specifically the wrong advice you've been given about cardio. Put another way, the misapplied advice you've been given about cardio. The main message here is something that carries through a lot of my videos. When we're really intent about finding a solution to a problem, we often restrict our options, right? We get a little bit tunnel vision. This is a natural part of how humans solve problems, especially in a context of need, in a context of, man, I don't know what I'm doing here. I really need help. We are more likely to begin to miss opportunities at that point. We're more likely to begin to get a little too rigid. And one of the main messages I have today is that when it comes to cardio, as with many things in diet and exercise, you have more options than you realize. You have more flexibility. You have more latitude. You can get away with a lot more than what a lot of fitness influencers are telling you. This isn't to say that people are wrong. This isn't to say that this is bad advice. It's just often misapplied. And that's what we're going to get into right now. Over the years, if you've been paying attention to fitness advice, we've seen different types of activity come into vogue and go out. And we've seen different diets and eating styles. You know, the fad will rise and then it will die away. All the advice was saying, hey, high intensity interval training is the most optimal cardio. It takes less time. You burn more calories per minute. You're going to get the afterburn. Anybody remember hearing about afterburn? It's going to melt fat. It's going to build muscle. It's going to make your body just more anabolic. Like you ever look at those sprinters in the Olympics? Look how buff they are, even though they're runners. PEDs. Forget about that. No, there is a lot too. You know, the physiological differences between a type 2 muscle fiber dominant sprinter and a type 1 dominant marathon runner. But we've seen these fads with cardio, and it can happen just the same way as with diets. Kind of upholding one method as, you know, the one method to rule them all. It's the we're gonna take this idea and turn it into a golden calf, and we will all bow down and worship it because now we've found the answer. Every time one of these cycles hits where something becomes preeminent and then dips away, there tends to be waves of misapplied information relating to that. And I'll say again, a lot of this stuff happens in well-meaning ways from well-meaning people. It's just that they're not always explicit about who their audience is. Right? So this isn't a video about here's the right cardio advice and here's the wrong cardio advice and here's what's supported by science and here's what's not. That's not really what we're going to get into. I want to talk about something that I've never really seen talked about on YouTube, and that's really identifying the need for nuance in cardio recommendations for fat loss, depending on who we're talking to, right? And my audience, for the most part, is people who have a significant amount of weight to lose. Maybe they want to lose muscle. I sure hope they do. I want to help you gain all the muscle you possibly can. And though the basic physiology is the same and applies to everyone, on a strategic level, the things that are important for you to prioritize are going to be very different than someone in other life situations, other athletic aspirations. So let's take an example of Sam, okay? Nice amorphous name, right? It's not a boy name or a girl name. It's just Sam. And Sam is buff. They've built up more muscle than they would have had just as a normally active, healthy person, right? So they are above the mean. They had to go out of their way to create that muscle. And if they were to stop working out and stop eating their protein and stop consuming enough calories, his or her body would no longer maintain that level of muscle mass. A lot of advice in the fitness community is aimed at the Sams of the world. For good reason. The Sams are dialed in. They're on YouTube looking for this stuff. A lot of the clicks and views are coming from the Sams or the aspiring Sams. But then we have Chris's. And the Chris's of the world, they look at the Sams and they're like, hey, I want to be buff and ripped. And oftentimes they find those people on YouTube and say, I want to look like you. So what do you advise I do? Problem is, if that fitness influencer is talking to Sams and you happen to be a Chris, and Chris weighs 290 pounds and he or she or they are 5'3", starting to see where I'm going with this? These are very different situations physiologically. Chris has an abundance of body fat. Now, in a way, Chris's activity level or lack thereof, Chris's eating, possibly poorer nutrition, excess calories, hormonal imbalances, there could be a lot of things supporting Chris's excess weight. And one of the ways Chris can think about losing weight is taking those supports away, even though a lot of times it actually looks like adding things in. Ultimately, eating food is an activity. You have to do it every day. If you stopped doing that, you would lose weight. I'm not suggesting that. It's just to say that even though we don't think of eating as a chore, it is a task. And if we don't do it, we cannot maintain our weight. So Sam and Chris are propping up with their behaviors two very different types of mass. One is lean mass and one is fat mass. Good advice for Sam is going to do a few things. It's going to make sure they don't burn off their muscle mass, right? Because that tissue is metabolically active where fat tissue isn't. It means it burns calories every day. The body's going to be very tempted to get rid of that if we push it to extremes. So Sam needs to be more moderate, both in the kinds of activity they choose and in how fast they lose the weight. Whereas Chris doesn't have to be as moderate. Sam probably needs a higher protein intake to support the muscle, especially in a calorie deficit. But one of the main differences between Sam and Chris is that Sam's health is not at risk because of the amount of fat they're carrying. It's maybe a physique issue or maybe a health improvement, but we're not talking about morbid obesity. Whereas for Chris, do we want Chris to lose muscle mass? Heavens no. But Chris's muscle mass, is it above the normal fitness level of a healthy individual? No, it's actually below the mean. If Chris just starts moving and starts walking or doing any kind of activity, that's probably going to support muscle growth at first, even though for Sam, that could be a threat to the muscle. Make sense? So there's a skittishness around cardio, especially in the advice aimed at Sam, for good reason. Because it can be done to extreme. Take anything to extremes, you're going to run into trouble. But Chris has a lot more latitude. Chris does not have to risk losing muscle mass in the same way Sam does, right? Sam's got to keep a boulder at the top of a hill and put in some effort to keep it there. Chris is at the bottom of the hill. It's not as good of a situation. However, there isn't as much risk of the ball rolling wildly out of control, i.e. losing significant amounts of muscle mass, although it can be done. And it's really sad when obese people go to extremes to the point where even they harvest lean muscle mass off their body for calories, and then they really screw themselves when it comes to maintenance, things like that. So now that we've painted a bit of a picture of the two ends of the spectrum, let's talk about some of the advice and some of the methods of cardio that get talked about and I think often misapplied. Whereas high intensity interval cardio was all the rage for the Sams of the world, a lot of influencers and fitness professionals have been pumping the brakes on it, almost poo-pooing it in a way, as in redressing an imbalance of pro high intensity interval training recommendations that proliferated for a long time there. So you see a lot of people talking about the negatives or the negative potential impacts of high intensity intervals. These are real things. It's just that they get pushed quite hard, and that's going to apply very differently for Sam and for Chris. So for instance, the afterburn effect, it's not as big of a deal as people used to make it into. Science has proven that it's actually quite small. One of the issues with high intensity training of any kind is that it induces a lot of fatigue, a lot more fatigue per calorie burned, you could say. It allows you to burn calories really quickly, but the fatigue per calorie can be higher than more moderate forms of cardio. Make sense? And fatigue isn't just in your mind. This is a real thing that accumulates in your body, and you have to manage it. For the Sams, they have to manage it especially because Sam is also devoting a lot of time and energy to lifting weights, to maintain or even build muscle while losing fat. And in most cases, it's just praying to maintain while on a cut. The other factor is injury risk. And this is important for both camps, actually. The higher the intensity, if you're doing some level of sprint, whether it's on a bike or a rowing machine or at the park running, avoiding injury is one of the absolute smartest things you'll ever do in this journey. For Sam, an injury could totally mess up the whole program and affect the ability to lift weights. Forget cardio. For Chris, an injury trying to run at 295 pounds on a small frame and joints that haven't been very active, especially sprinting, could be a recipe for disaster. And now all of a sudden, Chris has trouble walking, let alone running or sprinting. So we want to avoid extremes in both camps. I think that's fair. But as far as the training fatigue, this is going to be more of a negative for the Sams than the Chris's. Make sense? This wouldn't be my personal recommendation for the very beginning of a weight loss program, especially if you are significantly overweight. However, I benefited from this style of training. And if your overall amount of time you devote per week to exercise in your weight loss program is on the lower end, high intensity interval training or any kind of interval training can be an effective use of your time. And if you are only doing 3 sessions a week of cardio, it's not like you have this excessive training fatigue that you have to deal with. And again, that's not just related to overall cardio during the week, but any other training. Another big piece of advice is not to do steady state intense cardio, or what some call moderate intensity steady state. And moderate here is kind of a tricky word because if you're doing moderate intensity steady state cardio, it doesn't feel moderate, right? You are running and gunning. You are pushing the pace about as hard as you can for a significant window of time. And there have been many an athlete who has abused this, and either in their cardiovascular training, because this style of training is fantastic for building cardiovascular endurance and cardiovascular health. It burns a lot of calories, not as many per second as high intensity intervals, but it can be a lot. Especially as you get fitter and fitter and you can push harder and harder, you just end up burning more and more calories. So when people start to have success with this, they can easily take it to extremes in their pursuit of their fitness goals. But when the Sams of the world do that, it does become even more tricky to maintain their muscle mass. So a lot of times advice for the Sams of the world is gonna restrict moderate intensity steady state cardio or zone 2 cardio to certain amounts of time per week. For example, half the time you spend in the weight room, only devote that much or less to moderate intensity steady state cardio because it can interfere with muscle building and muscle retention. And then there's a training fatigue aspect to it as well. But again, the Chris's of the world don't need to think too much about these things. The Chris's of the world have more latitude. Moderate intensity, steady state cardio, as long as your doctor is okay with it, can be the staple of a great weight loss program. The type of cardio that's having its heyday right now is low intensity, steady state. It's had a real big comeback in the last few years, low and slow, because there is almost no interference with pathways of muscle building and muscle retention. There's low to no systemic fatigue, training fatigue accumulated through, things like walking or very low intensity biking. And there's very low injury risk. Whereas, with high intensity interval training or even moderate intensity, there's a higher risk of injury. Now, this can absolutely be a great place to start if you have a significant amount of weight to lose because your ability is lower. So low intensity is all you can really do and all you should safely do. Other people find themselves at very high weights, even though they've maintained integrity in their joints and maybe they're even a bit more active, right? So it really just depends. The thing that's going to be important, although in different ways, for both Sam and Chris is injury risk mitigation. We don't want to get injured in either case. And so, we've talked about what's different, but what's the same in both cases is not pushing any one tool, no matter how effective, to extremes. We don't want to put too much of the success of our program on any one thing. Another similarity is that in either case, when it comes time to make adjustments to ensure progress on the scale or in the measuring tape or whatever, that we choose a combination of increases in activity or increases in the intensity of our activity, along with decreases in caloric intake. So not relying too much on one or the other. So the good news for the Chris's of the world is that a lot of the advice you hear about cardio telling you, avoid this or be careful with this, a lot of that doesn't apply to you. Obviously, you need to be careful. Obviously, you need to check in with your doctor about what's safe for you to do. You're not going to run this risk of burning off your muscle anywhere near in the same way as the SAMs, especially if you're taking the minimum effective dose approach, right? You find a level of activity that's sustainable, that allows you to do it consistently, and God forbid is fun, that you can pair with other activities that you find enjoyable, listening to music, listening to books, listening to podcasts, even reading a book. I used to read books on the bike. Only doing what you need to do to get the progress you want to see on the scale, and then only making small adjustments as necessary only when things have really stalled out in your program. As long as you're doing that, you're way less likely to run the risk of side effects. Same way a doctor prescribing a pill for a condition knows to start you at a very small dose and work it up from there till the dose is effective. And that way you run the least risk of there being side effects. Or if side effects do show up, it's not as severe and you can back off before any real damage is done. So it's about finding that sweet spot. And I'm going to do more videos about how you find that sweet spot, because it can be very tricky. It can be one of the hardest things in this process. But to end the video, I just encourage you to move. Your success will be found in any sort of movement that allows you to burn more calories throughout the day. It doesn't even have to be traditional cardio. You could play with your kids more. You could play with your dogs more. Anything that gets you up out of the chair or up off the couch is probably going to help. And I can't impress upon you enough the importance of taking our sometimes narrow focus and widening it up so we can actually see the full plethora of options in front of us. And this is especially important when you really need to lose weight and you know that your future and your health and your dreams depend on it. It's really easy to slip into our survival mechanisms right when we're trying to shed them because of the importance of doing so. And this is one of the biggest tricks in making weight loss easy, is to really choose to open up. You have a lot of options. Just be open, be receptive, say yes to things, say yes to the impulses to move, to be more active, because those impulses are there. We're just ignoring them. We're really good at ignoring the positive impulses and really good at paying a lot of attention to negative impulses, whether we say yes to them or not. I really hope this clarifies the cardio confusion and helps you decide what the right type of cardio is for you today. And again, we don't have to pick one style and stick with it forever. You're always only taking the next step. You're only losing the next pound. You do not have to choose the one and only. Not only do you have options, your options can change day to day. And if you have questions, you can ask them in the comments below. If you're looking for more ideas on how to implement cardio into your life, head on over to the Facebook group, Lose Weight with John. You can ask questions in the group, seek support. It's an awesome group of people who are going through exactly what you're going through in a lot of cases. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, throw me a comment down below for the algorithm, and please share this video with a friend. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.